Service denied. Going to read Chapter 1, so-called disabilities. Spanish War veterans. The New Deal. Probably should go get my coffee. Really digging this earth on here. Spanish War veterans of the New Deal's Economy Act. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States started its ascent to world power, fighting in the Cuban and Philippine jungles. The men who volunteered for those conflicts made up the first generation of the American veterans. Subsequently, U.S. involvement in world wars, small wars, counterinsurgencies, Cold Wars, hot wars, ensured that every generation had its own wars. This high tempo of overseas involvement began in 1898, when the United States fought and won a war against the dying Spanish Empire in the Caribbean. After a longer, more deadly counterinsurgency in the Pacific, the United States claimed the Philippines outright. The Spanish Wars, the Spanish-American and the Philippine-American War, created a new generation of veterans who lived alongside other veteran cohorts spawned by America's rise to world power. In time, Spanish war soldiers' service was forgotten, or at least minimized, by generations of Americans that came after them. Ironically, they may have been first generation of marginalized American veterans in the 20th century, but sadly not the last. The generation of 1898 belonged to two veteran organizations. The first still exists, the Veterans of Foreign Wars. And the other, the largely forgotten, still exists. Largely forgotten United Spanish War Veterans does not. A notable distinction between these groups may explain why Americans minimize the service of Spanish-American war veterans. Most men who enlisted to revenge the USS Maine never went overseas. These men joined the USWV because they could not join the VFW, which, as its name suggests, accept only those that went overseas. Hi, Fred. I'm reading from a book that my friend contributed called Service Denied, and it's about marginalized veterans communities. You know that even though the first war was the Civil War, the next was the Spanish-American Wars at the 1898. And that a lot of these people never really went overseas, but that's when we took the Philippines. We took the Philippines and we took, I just read it, Cuba. So there's the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, still exist. I was just watching Earth from outer space. My coffee's almost gone. I have to go get some more. As an orator, I like to read. So the VFW later welcomed overseas veterans of World War I and World War II and continues to admit veterans of the 21st century wars. Though forgotten, the U.S. WV was long-lived. It formed in 1904 and folded in 1992 after the last Spanish war veteran passed away. Wow, that's a long time, in 1898 to 1992. So veterans live a really long time. At the height of the membership in 1933, it had 126,000 members. This chapter examines Spanish War veterans after World War I, particularly in 1933 when Roosevelt administration Economy Act targeted Spanish War veteran benefits. Government officials singled out Spanish War veterans partly because of the marginalized status compared to other veterans. You know, there's still deported veterans living out their life in other countries as American veterans with no benefits, denied even to be recognized as a veteran of the United States military. It's appalling to me how the military, being a small percentage of our population, but we carry all those people and yet not acknowledged. Americans depreciated their service for several reasons. First, fewer Americans served in these wars. And by 1918, a much larger veteran cohort had replaced the men of 1898 in American public minds. The same phenomena affected later generations of veterans. World War II veterans overshadowed those of Korean War, for example. Second, the Spanish Wars were smaller than the wars bookended American memory in this era, the Civil War and the Great War. I don't know which one is called the Great War. To veterans of the larger conflicts, the Spanish Wars did not compare to their own epic clashes. Of course, they never do, right? An impression had exacerbated the Spanish War veterans' plight. Finally, veterans of other wars and non-veterans alike remembered the Spanish Wars as conflicts that incurred few battle casualties. As a result, Americans believed that these men were less worthy of national gratitude and financial, hi Smokey, and financial legacies. However, such arguments failed to grasp the Spanish War decades-long legacies to men who served. I agree. Just because the war was different than the other wars doesn't mean that someone's any less capable of receiving compensation. Consider, for example, the lingering effects of debilitating disease. Because of poorly planned and under-resourced mobilization efforts, thousands of soldiers sent to Cuba and the Philippines contracted tropical diseases and illnesses. And they lasted a long time. A lot of people lost feet and toes and all kinds of things. The case was the same closer to home, where a larger number of Spanish war volunteers were sickened in hastily built and unsanitary training camps. Yeah, they didn't have the, whatever. They would pay for the nation's Punerian lack of foresight. Overburdened and ill-equipped military medical staff struggled to provide adequate medical care and often neglected to document soldiers' illnesses. Consequently, a number of Spanish War veterans were forced to apply for non-service-related pensions, despite the fact their disabilities stemmed directly from wartime illnesses. Non-veterans scorned Spanish War veterans who received these payments because they believed their pensions had nothing to do with their military service. Thus, when the Great Depression created the budget crisis, officials targeted marginalized Spanish War veterans and their supposedly non-service-connected pensions. In addition to being marginalized, one of the Spanish wars, the Philippine-American War, has been largely erased from the official record. According to the Department of Defense online tabulation of U.S. war casualties, the Spanish-American War of 385 battle deaths, 2,161 deaths from disease, and 1,662 non-mortal wounds. Notably absent are U.S. casualties of the war in the Philippines, the 4,200 Americans who died, 1,053 in battle, more than 3,000 from disease, and the 2,900 who were wounded. While the dead of any war need no help, soldiers who were sick and survive, unaccounted in any record of any war, often require government assistance. In the case of the Spanish Wars, government officials undercounted disabled veterans of both Spanish and Philippine American wars because their illnesses were undocumented. If you don't document it, it doesn't exist. Make sure those people, even if they're flaky notes, they're notes. Acknowledge it. Put it in the record. Write it down. It doesn't matter. It's written down. We don't care if you're mocking me. Oh, whatever. Put down the crazy lady says. It's documented. Scholars have also dismissed Spanish War veterans. No single study exists documenting their service and their post-war organization. The United Spanish War Veterans. I wrote the first published article about USWV, and even then it was not solely about Spanish war vets. Instead, it chronicled the USWV's troubled relationship with the larger, better-known Civil War veterans group, the Grand Army of the Republic. In a broader study of the 20th century veterans and nationalism, peerless patriots, organized veterans, the spirit of Americanism, Rodney Mignot asked, generation of 1898, who remembers, much less cares about them now? Reflecting an American amnesia about these men and their wars. Similarly, when Stephen R. Oritz identified the relationship between the 1933 Economy Act and the rise of the VFW and the emergence of the New Deal dissent, Spanish and American Philippine-American war veterans received one brief mention because of a contemporary cartoon titled Some Call This Economy. In it, three veterans, a Spanish war veteran, Civil War veteran, and a World War I veteran, stood against a wall and were about to be executed by men in top hats and tuxedos. The artist drew the words U.S. Chamber of Congress and one executioner's back to indicate who they held responsible for these economies. While government erasures, scholarly neglect, and businessmen's willingness to sacrifice Spanish War veterans may seem understandable, Theodore Roosevelt's disdain for these wars, and by extension the men who fought them, is more surprising. Colonel Roosevelt's political career, which ended in his improbable rise to presidency, began in the Spanish-American War. When his volunteer regiment, the Rough Riders, charged San Juan Heights along, or perhaps behind, African-American regular Army cavalry troopers. In fact, the memory of Roosevelt's service and that of his Rough Riders eclipsed that of all other Spanish War veterans, white or black. Once president, Roosevelt declared major combat operations over in the Philippine-American War after 4 long years of war, even before operations ended. It must have been surprising to his comrades when Roosevelt asked the indulgence of his fellow Spanish War veterans, whom he called comrades of a lesser war, at a 1910 dinner attended by both Civil War and Spanish War veterans. Instead of lauding the sacrifice of his generation, he exalted the deeds of valor and heroic devotion done by men who wore the blue and those donned by the men who wore the gray, alike from a common heritage of honor for all Americans, no matter in what portion of the country they dwell. Roosevelt greeted the veterans of the Civil War as men of the big war, to whom he had to admit that our war was not very big, but it was there. But it was all there was. His description of a short war was protested by at least one member of the audience listening to these remarks, who shouted, "Long enough over in the Philippines." Any war is too long. Roosevelt shared many Americans' belief that the Spanish War began in April 1898 and ended in the ceasefire 3 months later. While the war with Spain concluded with the peace treaty in December of the same year, the United States fought a brutal counterinsurgery for nearly 4 years in the Philippines, including all operations in Cuba and the Philippines. The Spanish War lasted longer than the Civil War, April 25, 1898 to July 4, 1902. Roosevelt, the politician, may have understood the Civil War veterans and their families cast more votes than Spanish War veterans, who likely already supported him because of their shared service. The size of the veterans' cohort and the political power they wielded mattered. Lesser-known veterans disputed the notion that these men sacrificed little in small wars. Congressman George Huddleston served in the 1st Alabama Infantry during the Spanish-American Wars. Stationed in Miami, his unit suffered during the summer of 1898 from too little sanitation and too many insects. And eventually Huddleston and many of the others became ill. However, he reported to his congressional colleagues that the medicines and supplies were almost wholly lacking and medical attention largely a pretense. There were no nurses and no suitable food for the sick. I lay for 30 hours after admission to the hospital upon a bare board and my blouse folded under my head for a pillow, without seeing a doctor or receiving the slightest attention. Eventually he testified that half his unit sickened, racked by malaria, typhoid, and other diseases of semi-tropics. Within 60 days there was scarcely a sound man in the pestilence camp, and deaths had risen to an appalling figure. Huddleston's unit never went overseas. The war ended in Miami, or did it only begin there? According to the congressman, these men came away to be discharged without a medical examination, without any adequate record of having made of their disabilities, discharged to their homes, gaunt and fever-stricken, and bearing the seeds of disease to plague them throughout their lives. Huddleston understood why his generation suffered long after the war ended. Spanish War veterans had survived wartime disease with little medical intervention, and at least 20,000 Spanish-American recruits experienced typhoid fever in stateside camps, and 7% died. Volunteers with no military training and little discipline suffered more than regular Army soldiers because they failed to practice appropriate hygienic measures. Once a soldier became ill, there was no treatment. The best-known medical text of the day advised the medical profession was long in learning that typhoid fever is not a disease to be treated with medicines. Instead, the experts advised a special diet of barley gruel and antiseptics, including carbolic acid and iodine. Even if these treatments had been effective, typhoid fever was often misdiagnosed. Walter Reed, a famous Army doctor, and his colleague examined typhoid fever in every unit mobilized for the Spanish-American War. He and his team found that the Army physician diagnosed only 50% of the typhoid fever cases they later identified. 20,000 figure represents Reed and his team's estimate and not an actual number based on medical records. The toll may have been greater. Inadvertently, this report documented another disease with long-term chronic implications: malaria. According to a contemporary 1924 medical specialist, individuals who have malaria attacks who do not undergo sufficient treatments to destroy the infection frequently have subsequent attacks, and these constitute malaria relapse. Given the limited availability of medical treatment for Spanish War soldiers, many veterans of these conflicts likely endured chronic relapse due to poor health care. In addition to typhoid fever and malaria, Spanish War soldiers who served at home and overseas encountered a number of diseases that, left untreated, led to chronic illness, including leprosy, cholera, tuberculosis, and yellow fever. Complicating their post-war lives, Spanish War veterans had few medical records documenting their service-related disease exposure. As a result, these men applied for non-service-related pensions. These were all volunteers. You know, we go back and we find out that a lot of this military hype. It's hype. It's hype. I'm going to continue to read some more, but you don't understand with me.